Hey everyone, Brandon Robertson here, and welcome to Day 2 of the Imago Day Summit. I'm really excited to present to you this video of a conversation between two leading psychotherapists at the intersection of spirituality, sexuality, and gender identity. For this interview, I decided to kind of get out of the way, because this is not my area of expertise, and let the experts talk about the spiritual malpractice that's being promulgated at the ACBC's conference this week, and the actual damage, psychological, spiritual, mental damage that's done by teaching on sexuality and gender identity that includes repentance and suppression of who God made us to be. And so I really hope that you take some time to listen in to these two experts talk, and I really hope that the content that's presented here will be helpful and enlightening to the pastors and counselors who are at the ACBC conference, that they could hear the truth, and that the truth would touch them deeply and convict them and help them to become better ministers, better counselors, and better followers of Jesus as we delve deeply into these issues around sexuality and gender identity. Without further ado, here's a conversation between Dr. Lynn Fraser and Isaac Archuleta.
Hi, Dr. Lynn Fraser. My name is Isaac Archuleta, and we are here responding to a conference that's being hosted by the ACBC in the South. And I just wanted to briefly introduce you. You were the chairwoman of WPATH from 2011 to 2014. Can you describe your career and some of the accomplishments that you've had so far?
Hi, thanks, Isaac.
Yeah.
Well, I've been in practice as a psychotherapist for going on 40 years.
Okay.
That's hard to believe.
I bet.
And it's been in the same place in San Francisco, California. I've had the same office. And I actually see some of the same people that I saw 30 years ago. I don't still see them today. They've come back to therapy.
Okay.
So, and I started out as a person who had never seen trans people at all. I don't even know if I'd heard of it. But my very first client as a counselor, before I had even graduated, was a transsexual.
Wow. Okay.
And it just and I was really interested in her life, very interested in her. We hit it off, and I kind of mushroomed from there. She started referring her friends to me, and et cetera, et cetera. So that was way back when. And then more recently, I was elected to the board of directors for the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And after being on the board of directors for several years, I was then elected to be on what's called the executive committee. And then from there, I was elected to be president of that organization. And the reason that organization is, well, there are many reasons it's important, but it's comprised of interdisciplinary professionals globally who work with transgender people. And that's primarily surgeons, endocrinologists, lawyers, psychotherapists, psychiatrists. I mean, global professionals, and we write the international standards of care. And those are evidence-based guidelines for the care, for the health of transsexual, transgender, and gender nonconforming people. And I was in the mental health part of those standards.
Gotcha.
That's in a nutshell.
Yes.
From A to B, 40 years.
Yes. And so those standards of care that WPATH writes, who are they writing those for?
Well, we're writing them primarily for other providers.
Okay. So other people who sit with trans clients.
People who work with trans clients, yes, but globally.
Okay.
Not just within the United States, globally. So they take into account what we would see internationally in working with trans care.
Okay. It sounds very comprehensive.
Very comprehensive. And they used to be, because I was involved in the initial standards of care because I've been around for so long, they were based on professional consensus. But these latest standards, Standards of Care 7, are much more evidence-based.
Okay.
So to develop those standards, what the chair of the Standards of Care Committee did is he asked experts in different areas of care to do just these, to look at all the literature.
Mm-hmm.
And then together, and it was a long process, it took 3 years,
Mm-hmm.
get all the literature and then write global guidelines that are based on evidence,
Gotcha.
and professional consensus.
Sure. So some of the people who might be watching this video are pastoral counselors. And when you say evidence-based, what do you mean? How could we explain this for them?
Well, there are different levels of evidence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some are based only on rigorous scientific method,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the highest level of evidence. And then at the lowest level of evidence, it's based on professional consensus.
Okay.
So in other words, someone like myself, who I've seen hundreds of people over the years,
Mm-hmm.
and then I would be, in a consensus then would be, I would talk to somebody else who's worked with trans people over the
Right.
years. And we would then, what do we agree upon is in the best for helping trans people and not harming trans people.
Right. Right.
So, and actually some of our members, and we welcome people who are pastors. We have pastors in our organization
Interesting.
because, of course, the spiritual life of every human being is extremely important. As an aside, I minored in religion, and my granddaddy was a pastor, so
Mm-hmm.
I have that part as
Yes.
well. And so in the spiritual life, I mean, this is something that comes up all the time in my practice.
Mm-hmm.
People talking about their relationship to God or relationship to a higher power,
Mm-hmm.
however people conceive,
Sure.
whatever their faith tradition might be.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So welcome, pastors.
Yes. You know, it's interesting. You're the granddaughter of a pastor, and I'm the son of a pastor.
Oh,
And yes,
I
and
know that.
yeah, it's really easy for us to adopt this ideology that there's this divine creative design. And in this divine creation, there is a gender inside a specific body. And with trans people, we're not that's different. The gender identity is different than the physical natal sex. Some Christians would advocate that we can change the gender identity to match the person's bodily sex, male or female. How do we talk about this in a way where we can begin educating pastoral counselors who are focused on change? If you could say one thing to this group of people who believes that change is possible, what would you want to teach them?
Well, that's complicated because I don't think it's any one thing.
Absolutely.
I do think that people who have a strong faith, they're people who are really open to believing in the unseen.
Mm-hmm.
And what I learned over the years, just to backtrack, is that because I tried very hard to help people change their identity to match their bodies, because it just seemed like that would be the easiest thing. I'm not talking about faith right now, but it just didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would recommend is to really listen to what the person in your care is saying to you.
Mm-hmm.
And believe them.
Mm.
In your heart of hearts. One of the things I see, and I see this a lot, interestingly enough, is that my family's from South Alabama, and when I go back there and talk to people who are really Christians in their definition, I mean, in mine too, is that when I really talk about what I see and what I hear, they actually get it.
Mm-hmm.
They really get it, and because of the generosity of spirit, the hospitality,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is, the kindness that I find in Alabama anyway. I don't know about other people, but and so what I would say, I don't know, to go to your original question, is to listen with an open heart.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And to listen with an open heart to what people are actually saying to you,
Sure. Sure.
and not because there's what I don't know. I mean, I've probably said enough.
Sure. Sure. You said something very interesting in there, that these Christian friends in the South, when you talk to them and explain what you do, that they get it. What is it that's new information? What are they getting? What's shifting in their ideas?
Well, one thing, I think I'm one of them, and so
Mm-hmm.
they trust me,
Mm-hmm.
I think, and that they they're listening with their heart.
Mm-hmm.
Um, an interesting question, Isaac. What is it that they? Because it's not hard for them.
Mm-hmm.
It really isn't. They say, "Oh, now." Oh, I know one thing that always I think of when I talk to them is that they say, "I've never met anyone.
Sure.
I've never met anyone." And of course I know they probably have, but they don't know it because people are quiet and don't talk about it oftentimes because they're worried about stigma. But in their minds, they have never met anyone. And what I also know to be true is when you spend time with trans people, it's hard not to believe what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, in my life, when I've seen what happens to them over time when they transition and when they actually come into their fullness of themselves, they're so much happier.
Mm-hmm.
And they've usually spent many years feeling bad about themselves, again, because of stigma. I mean, just to educate for a sec about what it's like to be trans, there are two things that are really hard. One is that people oftentimes know that they are trans or that their core gender identity doesn't match their bodies. They may not have a name for it. A lot of people don't have a name for it,
Mm-hmm.
but they know something's wrong about that. There's a mismatch. But nobody else knows, and they don't tell anybody, so they get socialized to be who they're not.
Right.
And so they develop sort of a shell self with all the problems that come with not being yourself. And then the other is they're really worried about stigma. And so what that does too. So once they get to transition, or at least once they come to terms with who they are, they're so much happier.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay.
And then for those of them who have come from a Christian tradition, I might add, if they're welcomed
Mm-hmm.
as they are, I mean, of course, that's so important.
Absolutely. You know, in our field, we have this term we use, cisgender, and it means that our gender identity matches our physical body.
Right?
And when I have consults with parents of trans children, one of the things that I say is when we sit as cisgendered people,
Mm-hmm.
we have our gender identity internally in our physical body, but they feel sewn together.
Right.
And for the trans child, they have a gender identity, as you say, that feels like it's living in a shell of a different body.
Right.
And I agree with you, we really have to slow down here and really empathize, imagine. We have to imagine with a lot of courage in terms of what does that feel like to feel like the opposite gender inside of this male body. That's a reality.
I love that, what you just got through saying, Isaac. I mean, that's so true. And I think one of the things, I'm cisgender, you're cisgender apparently, but I mean our bodies match our identities, and it is hard to imagine.
Mm-hmm.
It's because most people don't have that. I mean, I've spent a lot of time imagining what it would feel like and how painful. Now, I've spent time imagining. I don't have to spend a lot of time imagining in the sense that I get to listen
Mm-hmm.
to tell me
Mm-hmm.
what that's growing up. Yeah.
So
And it's painful.
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Let's pretend just for a moment, and I'm being a little critical here, but let's pretend, because I know they're very well-intentioned people who are attending this conference. Let's just pretend for a moment that they don't quite get it yet. They can't make that distinction. They can't feel the shell from the gender identity.
Right.
And they're leaving this conference so motivated to get out there and compassionately help trans people change. They're going to go out there, they have this new language, these new concepts, they have all this new fresh biblical armor, if you will, but they're really compassionate.
Right.
And they're going to sit with someone in a Starbucks. They're going to sit with someone in a pastoral office. And they're going to advocate for change in front of their trans parishioner, their trans client. What harm might they be able to do?
Well, I don't think it's a good idea for any of us to try to tell somebody else, for one thing, what they should be doing with their lives. And trans people get enough of that from the entire world, telling them how they're supposed to be. It takes tremendous courage, as you can imagine, to say, actually, no, who I am is not what you're telling me. So, for a person in authority to tell a trans person or someone who identifies as trans, because, and when I say that, I mean that I cannot say that somebody is trans. Only that person can say it, in my view. And I am a psychotherapist. It just reinforces what they probably already heard. And if you could be in my shoes, listening to the stories of how often that's happened to trans people growing up, or even to trans people as adults, and how painful it is to hear from people they respect that they don't know their own mind, that they don't know their own identity. I think anyone can imagine how that might be harmful. Because people are not psychotic in their belief about their gender identity. I mean, most people know who they are in a gendered sense in the core of their being. So I would say listen.
Sure.
That would be listen.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I'm afraid that when we talk about change as evangelical Christians, because I am one, and I'm a therapist, so I have a different perspective, but by and large, when I hear evangelical Christians say we can change, I think what they're talking about is we can change the behavior. But from a clinical perspective, it becomes incredibly complex when we think we can change the identity when it's gender or the orientation when it's sexuality.
Right.
So I identify as bisexual, and if I chose to marry a woman, if I chose to marry a woman, people might say, "Oh, his orientation changed."
Okay.
But that wouldn't be true. I would still be attracted to men.
Yeah.
And I think the same for trans people is true, that even if they don't choose to transition, their gender identity remains stable.
Right.
It remains static.
Well, it actually, for trans people, for many trans people, I think that's 100% true. For many trans people, but I actually think, based on, and I would never have said this years ago. I think that there is, over the lifespan, some people's gender can be a little fluid, but they're not that common. I mean, I don't want to say that well, somebody outside of them can't change them.
Mm-hmm.
Let me put it that way.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
There's nothing that I could say to someone else that would change their gender identity
Mm-hmm.
or their sexual orientation, for that matter.
Sure. Absolutely.
You know,
Yeah.
so you are bisexual, and I can't even begin to speak for you about that experience. It's your experience.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody else can change it.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I'm answering your question. We're just having a conversation, I guess, about our lived experience working with trans people or gay people or bi people or straight people.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I'm hearing you talk, and I'm thinking about what it might feel like for a sexual minority or a trans person to be sitting with a pastoral counselor who is in that authority position.
Right.
And one of those pastoral counselors might respond to us by saying, we can't change them, but God can.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So we have just a couple minutes here. Let's empathize with that trans child, the 19, 21-year-old who's sitting in that pastoral office, and they're trusting that God can change them. If you could look that child in the eye, that young adult, what would you tell them?
With the pastoral counsel there?
Let's pretend you got to sit with them by yourself for just a moment.
Okay. I would just share that in my lived experience, that I haven't seen that happen.
Okay.
And that isn't what I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen lots of people try.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Lots of people try.
Mm-hmm.
And pray. Oh, so many people I know
Mm-hmm.
have said they prayed to make it. Well, they prayed two things. One, make it go away, but more actually have prayed, when I grow up, please let God turn me into, and then whatever their core gender identity is. That's what people.
So they're praying that prayer of desperation more than a prayer of
Right.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
Thank you.
We have a lot to learn from you, and thank you for sharing your wisdom.
I enjoyed talking with you too, Isaac.
Yeah, thanks.